going to share my screen with the audience. So just so you know, I think we get a good synopsis of what the book is about. It's about a number of different things. And included in that are such things as the Disaster Relief Act of 1974, which came out of the Hurricane Agnes disaster, which I would argue in the book is an important departure for disaster policy. And we'll talk about that very much at the end. Talk about the National Flood Insurance Program and how that may actually encourage people to take risks in floodplains. And then I also talk a little bit about why national floodplain policy and local floodplain policy should be somehow tweaked. Although actually Pennsylvania does a very good job of that, and we'll talk about that tonight as well. So we're going to dig right into that. I also talk a little bit about memory in the book, and a lot of you have memories of the Hurricane Agnes disaster or another one. And in many cases, those are memories of people coming together, people who found a common good in helping their neighbor or in rescuing individuals, sharing what they had, opening their home to people. And these are wonderful memories, but from a standpoint of public policy, they sometimes obscure the other memories we might need to have about what policy failures may have led to great disasters. And I'm struck in particular by the horrible disaster that we're all shocked at over in Turkey and Syria, where the earthquake led to the destruction of so many of these buildings that were supposed to be earthquake proof. That is bad public policy. These were supposed to be built and they were supposed to be monitored by the government. They were supposed to be safe, yet the death toll continues to rise from this tragic event. Those are the kind of things that, as a historian of policy, I'm interested in. And so we'll get into some of that as well. Overview tonight, I'm going to talk about, just very quickly, some things about flood control, some of the places that would be familiar to you in Pennsylvania that were impacted by the flood. I'm going to talk about some key people in Pennsylvania, and then public policy, and then long-term consequences. So if you'll bear with me for the next half hour or so, we'll just talk a little bit about Hurricane Agnes. It was what we would now call a Category 1 storm, formed off of the Yucatan Peninsula and struck the mainland United States around Pensacola, Florida. It then traveled up the East Coast and just unleashed torrential rains. Even though it was a hurricane, then a tropical storm, and then even some would argue a depression weather system, it killed 128 people, left tens of thousands of people homeless, cost in 1972 $3.1 billion in damage. And it is a historical flood of record in places like Richmond, Virginia, Ellicott City, Maryland, Harrisburg, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and Elmira and Corning in New York, where people still remark upon the impact of this storm now 50 years ago. So if you look at the track of Hurricane Agnes, you can see beginning on June 19th and occurring up through June 23rd, it came on the mainland U.S., lost a little bit of its power, but then gained it once it went back out on the Atlantic, veers back towards the mainland, and then stalled over the mid-Atlantic, where it tipped about, one person has estimated, a quarter of the volume of water found in Lake Erie on already saturated ground. As you well know, in Lancaster County, it had been raining for 9 days straight in June of 1972. So there was nowhere for the water to go. And then to add to it, inches of rain, 9 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, just incredible. And the cities affected, particularly along the Susquehanna River basin. So if you look at the map on the screen, you'll see anywhere from the Cohocton River up in New York, which joins with the Susquehanna. Corning, Elmira were struck, And then you get down, although Scranton was saved, it's not exactly on the river, Pittston, Wilkes-Barre, Harrisburg, and then as the river and its tributaries flow right into Lancaster County before you hit Maryland and the river system empties into the Chesapeake Bay, and the storm destroyed the oyster beds in Chesapeake Bay and caused disruption to fishing for an entire year. It was quite devastating. Now, people had expected some flooding, particularly after what was then considered to be the once-in-a-lifetime 1936 flooding along the Susquehanna Basin. The United States government finally picked up and began to do flood control projects throughout the United States, not just, say, on the Mississippi. And the idea was that there would be flooding, there would be some sort of relief, followed by new flood control projects. And what do I mean by that? I mean, building a dam to hold in the water, or perhaps building levees or dikes along a riverbank, right, to protect the city and the residents from flooding. The problem with this is we found from 1936 on is that this encouraged people to move closer and closer to the river because the views were nice. It was a pleasant place to set up a building. It was a nice place sometimes to have a factory or a restaurant. But that meant that you were actually encroaching on what we call the floodplain, the place where the water is naturally meant to go when the river topples over its bed. So floodplain encroachment, of course, only leads to, you guessed it, because it's a cycle, more flooding. So more flooding, more relief, more call for flood control projects. And this was a cycle up through 1972. And afterwards, there's a great deal of call to put a dam or some other flood control structure on Chickies Creek in order to protect the residents of Lancaster County from excessive flooding. Again, the problem with flood control projects is they're only meant to protect you against a certain level of flooding. So let's say your rule of thumb is 100-year flooding, say the 1936 flood. When Hurricane Agnes exceeded that, obviously the structures that were built could not contain it. Levees failed and dams were nearly overtopped. And that really can lead people, again, to a false sense of security. Well, there's a levee, there's a dam, we're going to be okay. I don't need to worry about this. But of course, as we found time and again, since 1972, when, for example, Hurricane Lee in 2011 struck the area, and some of you in Lancaster County remember the floods from 2018, some localized flooding. So floods are going to continue. And so structural barriers may not be the best answer. Certainly in 1972, though, a lot of people took comfort that they were protected. But again, if a dam fails, it can be disastrous. The kind of Wingo Dam right there just south of the border in Maryland, it kept the governor of Maryland up all night, concerned that it was going to fail. There were concerns locally. If you look in Harrisburg, Mayor Swenson had just returned from a trip and was panicking about a dam outside of Harrisburg, PA, worried that if it failed, which it could easily have, then it would have destroyed Harrisburg, even more than the flooding that did occur. So these are the kind of things that people need to keep in mind as we're talking about these disasters, because disasters don't just happen. They happen in specific locations, in spots where regional culture and electoral politics have a certain impact upon the way the people will respond. Certainly leads to changes in the way certain political actors will respond as well. The book covers New York. I'm going to cover tonight simply what happens in Pennsylvania. We really don't have time for the rest of it, but I encourage you to get the book if it's interesting to you at all. Like I said, for example, Corning was flooded, and this is a great image. If you've ever been to the Corning Glass Center, you probably recognize the large building in the center of the picture. Corning was devastated. Elmira, also devastated, city of 40,000, bisected by the river and inundated. Wilkes-Barre, if you've been there, you probably have seen a beautiful redesigned Riverwalk project down there. But in 1972, it was devastated. Market Street Bridge was destroyed. The city was flooded up through the second floor in some places. And then, to make matters worse in Wilkes-Barre, the floodwaters disrupted gas lines and fires broke out, and the fire department couldn't get to them. And some buildings in Wilkes-Barre burned right down to the water line. It was a tragedy compounded by a tragedy. Similar thing happened in Harrisburg, where not too far away from where the new governor's mansion was located, some buildings caught fire, and once again, the fire department unable to get there, the buildings burned to the ground. So it was a horrific and tragic event. The governor of Pennsylvania had to be evacuated by boat. Fortunately, they were able to, they were alert to the floodwaters and were able to get some of the very historic material out of the governor's mansion or up to the second floor before the devastation. In Lancaster County, where we're talking, you had 18 inches of rain all told. The flooding doesn't peak until the 24th, and 10 people died. And these are horrible tragedies. Some people were electrocuted. A firefighter lost his life trying to warn people. An Amish man and his son were swept by the flood waters. And his son was only 10 months old. And it's these sort of flash flooding that caught people sort of by surprise that is the most tragic of all. Our warning systems were not adequate, and people found themselves suddenly facing a flood as the waters rose dramatically on the 22nd and 23rd of June. 55 homes were completely destroyed. 3,000 houses were damaged. 3,200 people were left homeless in your county. 1,000 in Marietta alone. There was at least $10 million in property damage, and your crops for that year, tobacco included, were completely devastated. And I know you take a lot of pride in your historic covered bridges, and 6 of them were destroyed, and 17 bridges altogether. So for a very rural community, the damage was quite devastating for individuals who, again, they were caught by surprise. In Lancaster City, the mayor was at a convention, and the public safety director was off, perhaps on vacation, and the city clerk was put in charge. The city clerk had no emergency management experience, but was able then to rectify that immediately. They had essentially set up a call center. And they were fortunate in Lancaster City that the telephones were still operating. Telephone lines hadn't gone down. Electricity was still in operation in a number of spots. Most communities throughout Pennsylvania, though, for example, Wilkes-Barre, Harrisburg, they lost their electric lights, they lost their bridges, they lost their natural gas, which had to be turned off. They lost their telephone lines. And many of them had to take refuge in the second story. And of course, they had to live for up to a year in very tight conditions, because it took that long for these communities to be repaired, some much longer than a year. And in some areas, you can still see some of the blight from the floodwaters that occurred in June of 1972. So, for example, Marietta, again, the small community, but quite devastated by this flood. A third of the people had to be evacuated, and a number of the homes were destroyed. Mannheim was turned into basically a river, as 40% of that community was underwater. And again, people had to be rescued by rowboat, in part because the waters themselves were moving at a rapid pace. So when the waters broke into these communities, it might be going as fast as 35 miles an hour, which would knock a person down. And even though you'd be in shallow water, it could be dangerous. And of course, many people again lost their lives due to flash flooding. So just as a historic event, as a tragedy, the communities across Pennsylvania were just struck down. And what were they to do? Who were they to turn to? They turned to each other, obviously. And there's some wonderful stories of neighbors helping each other. There's terrific stories of the fire department stepping up, particularly in communities where the flooding receded after the 24th of June, and they were able to pump out their basements. But other people were not so fortunate. They were homeless. They were in schools, temporary fire departments, so fire houses, temporary shelters. It would be a while before the housing and urban development could come in and provide trailers for many of the people who left homeless, in part because the federal government couldn't just preempt Pennsylvania law or local ordinances. They needed to have permission from the state, and they needed permission from local governments on where they could put the trailers to help people. So in the first hours of this tragedy, people were just mystified and horrified, and they just wanted to get back to normal. It would be then our elected leaders and sometimes our appointed leaders who would have to take charge of trying to deal with this tragedy, which didn't just happen in Pennsylvania, although Pennsylvania and New York bore the brunt of the 128 deaths and the property damage. It was a national tragedy from Florida on up. 14 people alone in Florida died. And of course, there was devastating tornadoes in places like Georgia and South Carolina. So it was a national tragedy. Richard Nixon would call it the greatest tragedy strike the United States, and was, quite interested in the flooding, not maybe for the reason of humanitarianism. Sadly, Mr. Nixon, as you know, in June of 1972, was already embroiled in something that we call Watergate. He was aware to a certain extent after the fact that a break-in had occurred, and was encouraged by Haldeman, among others, to pay hush money to the burglars from the Watergate. So in June, his mind is on two things, but primarily he's focused on his own reelection. So he sees this tragedy as an opportunity to gain votes and new voters, particularly in Pennsylvania. So he will be exceedingly generous in providing aid to the people of Pennsylvania, New York, and other places. But sadly, he really wasn't as compassionate. He had to be really, shall we say, persuaded. He had his arm twisted to actually go and visit the damaged site. In fact, the weekend of June 23rd and 24th, he was headed to Camp David from the White House because he wanted to hang out and he wanted to put together his own team for the baseball all-star game. That was on his mind, but he was persuaded by his chief of staff that it would be wise for him to do more than a flyover and perhaps even visit an area. He does go to Harrisburg and visited some people who had been resettled temporarily in a high school, and met a young girl who had been separated from her family. But he didn't even visit the devastated areas until September of 1972, months after the fact, and only did so because his political rival, George McGovern, had visited in August. Instead, Nixon sent Agnew out to inspect the flood area, and Agnew, being a good VP, just told the president what he wanted to hear, which was everything was great, everything is fantastic, not to worry about all those people who were homeless, that the government was taking care of them, and that the spirits were high, and that the American community was responding with its usual aplomb. And this, of course, is not exactly what's happening. Meanwhile, there are other people in Washington well aware. For example, Congressman Dan Flood from Wilkes-Barre. Dan Flood is one of the more colorful characters. There's been a couple of books written about this gentleman from Pennsylvania, because he was a leading congressman and a subcommittee chair in the House Appropriations Committee, through which a good amount of the federal budget went. He was told on Friday that Wilkes-Barre was flooding, so he called up the Secretary of Defense, Mel Laird, said, "I need a chopper. I'm going to Wilkes-Barre, and it's going to be one flood against another." He wore a whipsaw mustache, liked to dress in capes and white suits, and was a character from, just almost like a comic book. But he was very, very powerful. So powerful that in order to make sure that Pennsylvania coal was still sold, even though it was anthracite coal, he required the Department of Defense to heat all of the American Army barracks in West Germany with that coal. And he was able to do it because he held the budget in his hands. He's one of the few people who never wanted to be president because he was more powerful than a president. Milton Shapp was your governor in 1972. Fascinating guy, a stunning contrast to New York's governor. And I only make that comparison because Rockefeller was this dapper, rich, third generation wealth American. He wore a tailor suit and everything was done. He had a team. Milton Shapp was a gentleman who was a self-made millionaire. Gerald Electronics, early cable TV magnate who had to fight the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania to get the nomination for governor, and then fought the Democrats as governor over such things as the budget. But I got to tell you, Shapp was your man in Washington and Pennsylvania. He was an all-time Nixon hater, and he really wanted to help the flood victims. He wanted to bring in aid, and he went to Washington and he tried to get other governors to help respond. He persuaded Pennsylvania legislature to provide $150 million in direct relief to the citizens of Pennsylvania, and even required them to pass an amendment to the Constitution so he could give direct grants to people and business. Great guy. Shapp and Flood toured a number of areas in Luzerne County, but Shapp was a presence everywhere and went up and down the state. In Pennsylvania, there were some people who were emergent leaders, and that often happens in communities devastated by flood. So, for example, Max Rosen was a federal judge who stepped off the bench at the request of the business community of Wilkes-Barre. And they asked him to put together a flood relief task force whose job it was to lobby Washington and politicians to make sure that they didn't forget about the people of Pennsylvania, particularly the people of Wilkes-Barre, but Pennsylvania as well. Min Matheson was a former labor leader. She was in the International Lady Garment Workers Union, had recently moved back to Wilkes-Barre, and was upset by the elite who were running things in Wilkes-Barre. The Flood Relief Task Force formed her own committee, the Flood Victims Action Committee, and used direct in-your-face tactics in order to try to get politicians and others to respond to the needs, because it was very easy for Washington to ignore, once the cameras left, the devastation and destruction in Pennsylvania. And there were a lot of policy failures along the way that led to this. National Weather Service warning systems needed to be upgraded. A lot of times people could not get weather service information except through broadcast TV or radio. And of course, they were not always apprised of what was happening if they didn't buy a subscriber service. Today, all you have to do is download an app on your smartphone and you'll know the weather all the time. If you have an Alexa, Alexa is constantly nagging you about there's a weather alert. But in 1972, that wasn't the case. And so people were unaware in many cases. And so when we think about these elements, you have a historic hurricane, tropical storm, and that falls over the mid-Atlantic and pours torrential rains down. That's expectable. But what is not expectable, I suppose, is the policies that have endangered people to put them into this situation. For example, building very close to a floodplain, not having adequate disaster warning systems, perhaps not capable of dealing with the trauma. So by 1972, we had a federal disaster policy for about 22 years. Prior to that, Congress had enacted ad hoc legislation to deal with a disaster, to provide some relief. The United States relied largely on the Red Cross, which had been our officially recognized task force. We didn't have an emergency management system. We didn't use terms like first responder. No, we had local leaders who relied on very weak civil defense agencies. And throughout the disaster that occurred in Pennsylvania and other places, there was oftentimes a lack of communication between, say, the county and the towns, or the state and the local governments, and certainly the federal government and the local governments. This kind of fragmentation made things very difficult for the citizens of Pennsylvania. Our emergency management system, if you will, was run out of the White House, but it wasn't just for natural disasters. It dealt with many hazards. For example, food prices were soaring in 1972. There were problems with fuel that were brought to the attention of the Office of Emergency Management. And that agency had dealt with a terrific hurricane, and I don't mean terrific in a good way, probably terrible would be a better word, in 1969 called Camille, which was probably a Category 5 that destroyed the Gulf Mexico area, wiped out entire communities. And so in 1969, the agency had basically failed in its duties, and was doing a self-study in 1972 when this disaster struck. And again, on top of all of that, you've got many people thinking about becoming president. You've got Richard Nixon. Milton Shapp, who was governor of Pennsylvania, had hoped that he could move the Pennsylvania delegation to support McGovern or Humphrey, who was also vying for the role and have Pennsylvania be a kingmaker, so he could perhaps be the first Jewish vice president in American history. In 1976, Shapp would run for president, and that was the ambition of a number of people. In 1972, Nixon was still smarting from the 1968 election, where he had, although won the electoral vote, he had not won the popular vote very well. If you look carefully, we're talking about 500,000 votes. And if it hadn't been the third party candidate, George Wallace, Hubert Humphrey probably would have been president in 1969 through 1973. Meanwhile, in 1972, we're facing a number of crises of confidence in the United States. We begin to see beginnings of inflation. We have mistrust in government due to the Vietnam War, Pentagon Papers, and other historical events. The Watergate break-in is not going to make things any better. And so Nixon, in the milieu of all this, is thinking, okay, how can I swing support back to me? And he put together, like I said, a very generous program. He's going to forgive the first $5,000 borrowed. He's going to give people loans at below market value of 1% to rebuild. He's going to provide legal services, unemployment compensation, worth about $1.7 billion. And he included some pre-Agnes disasters to win support in Congress. He sends that to Congress, but the Democratic Congress is a little leery of giving Nixon such a good win, and they sort of drag their feet a little bit. And it's not until August that this legislation is passed. Meanwhile, all of the victims in Lancaster County, without 3,200 left homeless, or the tens of thousands throughout Pennsylvania in places like Wilkes-Barre and Harrisburg who need a home, they're still waiting for some sign that the federal government is going to help them. And when the money does come, it doesn't come free. One of the things Milton Schaap did, which made him so heroic to the people of Pennsylvania, was he wanted to have full equity. He wanted the U.S. government to step in and give full restitution to individuals who lost property. He wanted the government to pick up the tab. Nixon said no, and instead he suggested that the government provide loans. Well, loans are great, except if you've already paid off your mortgage and now you're essentially remortgaging your home to rebuild it, or that you're halfway into a mortgage and now you have to borrow more money. And it turns out that this kind of action really doesn't help the individual who's needing to borrow that money to repair. And so, the money comes from the federal government. It goes to banks and subcontractors who are going to come in and do the building. The individuals then remortgage their homes and businesses. And oftentimes the money flows right out of the area and leave the locals with the bill. So even though $1.7 billion was going to be aimed at assisting people to deal with this disaster, it's not going to really affect the everyday life circumstances of people. It's 1972, and we're already seeing the signs of deindustrialization in places like Elmira and Harrisburg. The storm's going to have a devastating impact upon the railroads and upon Piper Aircraft and some other business entities in Pennsylvania. It's going to shut down the Faber Pencil factory in Wilkes-Barre. It's going to cause a number of disruptions to the economy in areas that are struggling already. So, for example, federal aid is going to come in and it's going to help cities like Wilkes-Barre rebuild, but Wilkes-Barre never really came back. They've tried a casino to help the economy, Pocono Downs and some other things were reconverted, but it really hasn't helped the local community. Wilkes-Barre is still struggling today, 50 years later. Elmira, similar story. They rebuilt their downtown, but drove out their small business, fell into a decline, and tried to use prisons as a means to support the local economy, which actually hindered the economy rather than helped it. The only city I can think of that did well afterwards was Corning, but that's because they had private capital from the Houghton family, who owned the Corning Glass Works. Eventually became Corning Incorporated, but they reinvested all of the money. They built a museum, and they decided that Corning would now be a destination for tourism, as opposed to a place where they would manufacture glass products and Pyrex and the other things that people in the 1970s would have had. They also were smart, and they invested in fiber optic cable, which of course became very important with the internet. Lancaster County, you saw $4.3 million in SBA, or Small Business Administration loans, to help people rebuild. But as quoted in the paper at the time, people like Mrs. Tracy felt, we're back where we started from. We're back. We thought we were looking towards retirement, and now we're rebuilding everything that we had. And there's cases like that. People like the Schenck family who had that tavern, which is like 200 years old, and once again they had to rebuild from scratch. Although the community was very supportive and came back, but it was just a gut punch for a lot of families coming out of this. Now, in Lancaster County, the crops were devastated in 72, but it was literally a bumper crop in 1973, so agriculturally. Lancaster really wanted some new flood control projects, and for years, I have to say, the people of the county were teased by study after study by the Susquehanna River Commission and by the Army Corps of Engineers and others, kept saying, well, okay, maybe we'll build a dam. But in the end, they essentially came up with storm valves, backflow valves on the storm drains to stop the river from coming up through there. And to some extent, some dams that were built just south of the border of New York and Pennsylvania, Tioga, Hammond Reservoir, and the Cowanesque Dam does control the Susquehanna to some extent, but even to this day, Chickies Creek continues to flood and continues to bedevil people in your community. Meanwhile, the long-term consequences, the federal bureaucracy was too slow. Victims, particularly in Wilkes-Barre, because they were a sizable city, and they had someone like Min Matheson who organized, were outraged that it was August and they still hadn't gotten a trailer. They had not gotten any respite from the government. They were living in cities that were still devastated. Roads were still buckled. Their house was still in disrepair. They hadn't had a hot meal. Some of them wouldn't have a hot meal for a year. So they encountered Nixon's representative in Wilkes-Barre in August of 1972 and just demanded the federal government act. Milton Schaap was there, and he once again brought up the idea, why don't you just pay for these people? And he brought up, for example, after World War II, when the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, why couldn't we rebuild the state of Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, Luzerne County, right? Why not? And we talked about all of the money we were wasting in Vietnam, blowing things up and then rebuilding them. And so a lot of this rhetoric got under the skin of Nixon's representative, George Romney, who father of Mitt Romney, who responded in a way that led to him being cashiered by Richard Nixon. He was told to resign, and then he sort of eked out the rest of his time in Washington. And then in December of 72, packed his bags and was not ever in politics again. Meanwhile, Richard Nixon is concerned that he's got to do something. He's losing the people of Pennsylvania. So he sends in this guy, Frank Carlucci, to become the flood czar of Wilkes-Barre. And that idea of an independent administrator in a disaster is really what's going to give rise to FEMA. Carlucci likes to brag, well, he's passed away now, liked to brag that he was the grandfather of FEMA because when Jimmy Carter was putting that together, he sent people to talk and to interview him about what would be some good ideas to deal with disasters in the future. Nixon himself would go to Wilkes-Barre in September 9th of 1972, after the governor had made a widely publicized and popular visit to that city. Yes, he did all sorts of very charming things. Richard Nixon 101 was actually quite charming. He's not the Dan Aykroyd figure from the old Saturday Night Live. Well, maybe he is to somewhat, but that was only in public. In private or one-on-one, he could be a warm and gracious person, and certainly won over the people of Wilkes-Barre. In fact, he won over the people of Pennsylvania because in 1972, he won a historic victory, winning every state but the state of Massachusetts and the newly electoral votes from the District of Columbia. So Nixon wins re-election, uses this disaster in Pennsylvania and other places for his own political gains, and then immediately in the new year, cut his benefits, eliminated the Office of Emergency Preparedness, and put it under HUD, which had been considered to be a particularly poorly run agency in 1972, and then began to plan ways to take responsibility off of the federal government and put it onto the state and local entities. And that's where the 1974 Disaster Relief Act is going to come in, and the 1973 Flood Protection Act, which is going to then require, if you have a federally backed mortgage, you're going to have to get flood insurance. Otherwise, you won't be eligible for disaster relief. That was at least the idea, but of course, Congress time and again waived that requirement for people. In fact, by 1974, Lancaster County, I think 362 people had purchased flood insurance in an area, of course, that had been devastated in 72 and again in the future. Don't want to dwell too much on the Disaster Relief Act, just to say that it was significant in this by providing funding for planning and mitigation. It gave $200,000 to each state. We began to see the seeds of what we today think of as emergency management. And some of that money is going to go to the Emergency Management Training Center just south of the border of Pennsylvania in Emmitsburg, Maryland. And it's going to provide yet a new generation of people who began to think carefully about disasters rather than reacting, forecasting and planning for them. And that's really going to be significant for our personal safety today. Then there was also this desire to begin to move people off of the floodplain. Even though there were some structural supports built, the Army Corps of Engineers did a beautiful job in Wilkes-Barre. As you know, in Lancaster, instead of providing, say, new flood barrier structures, flood planning has included attempts to remove buildings along some of the rivers, and also dredging or some of the silt out of Chickies Creek and other places. And some of that is due to this guy, Franklin Curry. And I'm going to wrap it up because I know you probably have lots of questions and you want to comment on specifically what's happening in Lancaster. But he was from Sunbury and saw floods as natural and floodplain development as unnatural, which didn't make him the most popular guy in Pennsylvania. 1973, he tried to get the Pennsylvania Flood Disaster Act passed, which would give control not to local governments to deal with floodplains, but the state. And it was unpopular until a devastating flood hit Johnstown. Johnstown flood of the 19th century, repeated in 1977. The Pennsylvania State Ledge did approve this. And so the state environmental department has not been a fan of any kind of structural barriers. And instead, Chickies Creek, which I spell correctly, changed its name in 2002 to reflect the Napi term for place where you get crayfish, but definitely to improve function. Jimmy Carter will talk to Frank Claralucci and others when he becomes president in 77, and will eventually create FEMA. And then as we wrap it up and you're sitting there, if you've been through a flood or you know people who have, do you think you're safer now than you were in 72? Do you think the local and state emergency management is better equipped? Do you feel that you're prepared, that you'll listen to warnings? The reason I say that is because I've written a book on the blizzard of 1977, and Buffalo had a terrible blizzard just around Christmas time this past year in 2022, and over 40 people died. Even though there'd been immense attempts by the government to warn people, but people took risks. They seem to be unaware. So do you feel safer? And how do you feel about federal disaster response, for example, things like the flood insurance program? And have you ever seen how elections can be shaped by disaster? So I'm going to leave you with those questions because I'd like to hear your responses. You've been very kind to listen to me. So I'm going to start over to Q&A. So Emily.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for the talk. And I'll just say one thing about that's really interesting and I'm appreciative of is adding all the details about Lancaster County, because the book, doesn't focus on that so much and has a lot of other really interesting stories. So it was great to bring that stuff in. And then also a plug for other people to buy the book and read the book is that there are some other really great stories, really interesting stories in there. Does anybody have any questions to start us off? I have some that I can pose, but I'll let the audience take the first stab if anybody has something. Well, I'll say that one of the things that I was really interested in when I was looking at the book is how the different communities responded once they did or did not get funding. Excuse me. And I'm particularly interested if you can to tell the audience a little bit more about the differences between particularly the places that moved towards deindustrialization and really had that impact on their communities versus then the example of Corning, where they were able to move on a little bit more robustly with certain investments.
Yeah. So again, part of the problem is when we say we want to return to normal, for example, Wilkes-Barre was like, okay, so in the past, they had devastating tornadoes. They turned to the private sector to deal with it, which is why they asked a federal judge, Max Rosen, to come in and pretty much to redevelop. And they thought, okay, so what do we need? We need more highways. All right, because highways, the car is the big thing. So they built a Wyoming Valley Expressway. They thought, okay, well, how did we stimulate the economy when coal started declining? So they went back to that playbook and tried redevelopment corporations. But the problem was that it was 1972, not 1952. And what they staved off for about 10 years was the real impact of deindustrialization. And in fact, there were people in Scranton, just outside of Wilkes-Barre, who joked, boy, I wish we'd had a flood, all that money coming in, ha ha. But yes, the redeveloped areas by the 1990s. And when I was doing research for the book, I went to all of these communities and a lot of empty storefronts and a lot of boarded up buildings from areas that you would think would have recovered, but they tried to keep the old industry. Same thing with Elmira, New York. They had the world's largest typewriter manufacturing company, the Remington Rand. They had one of the few places where they still made fire trucks in the United States. And they thought, okay, so what we need to do is we need to re-stimulate that economy, and they clear away the downtown, they get rid of the small mom and pop stores and build parking garages, because that's what's going to bring people down here. Again, thinking it was in part Corning, where you had already sort of the Houghtons already had a plan in mind for the future. And the flood gave them the opportunity to work with the community to invest in that. And I'm not, the Houghtons didn't take any money out, right? So they kept Watkins Glen, which is now a fantastic race center. They kept that going. They invested money in museums and tourist attractions. They invested in the Corning Glass Center, which, every year, hundreds of thousands of people flock to. It's that kind of forward thinking that out of a disaster like this can happen. But I also have to say this, none of the communities I mentioned really talk to all of the community members. And we're much more sensitive to the needs of our diverse community members. And I got to say, the Black community in all of these areas, although not large in a couple, was often ignored completely. And in some ways were victimized, because as they chose what areas they were going to clear from the riverfront, they didn't necessarily place that housing with other housing. So there's a sad tale in there too. But yeah, every community decides. And I think that's fascinating. As Lancaster, the communities here, Marietta, right, and Mannheim, and even and I'm gonna mispronounce this. I think it's Littis. Is all of these places dotting a very rural area, but then devastated. How they responded and what they thought would preserve and protect their communities in the future. And again, time moves on, and floods have continued to plague your area.
So we've got a couple of questions from the audience. One is, do you think NFIP creates a moral hazard by transferring risk from the individual to the government due to the subsidized program?
Wow. Okay. You are spot on. I don't know who you are, but you are a genius. Yes, that is what we call that. It's a moral hazard. And it goes way back in time. Since the 1940s, people have said, ooh, if you don't make insurance, national flood insurance actually equal to the cost, you're only subsidizing people to rebuild. And again, I know that sounds horrible, like, because now I'm saying, well, you can't rebuild your home because you were on a floodplain, or I'm going to make your flood insurance cost what it really would on the market instead of having Congress subsidize that. There was an attempt in 2012, Maxine Waters was one of the co-sponsors to do that. But some people saw their flood insurance go up to like $10,000 a year because they lived in a repetitive flood zone. And I think all of you can think, wow, think about all those $1 million mansions like on the Outer Banks where people go and they get swept away on a fairly regular basis. And then the government steps in and helps them rebuild. And I'm not talking about ordinary citizens. I'm talking about people who are making choices and putting people and sometimes property, but also memories, your part of your life, things that you've collected can be destroyed. So yeah, I would say that we absolutely have a moral hazard, which is why Pennsylvania gets the gold star. You have removed more dams on your rivers than any other state I can think of. And removing dams, you mentioned Mill Creek. That actually allows a healthier river system, allows the natural sponge of woodlands and water to be absorbed, and then you don't need these artificial structures, which sadly then just send the water to other people. The other thing is you have to be careful about where you build. The more concrete, the more asphalt, that water is got to be carried somewhere, and it's got to find an outlet, which is why you're getting flash flooding in places you didn't get them before. So you've removed more dams, and you've been much better about buying up people's houses and saying, we're just not going to continue to put people on this floodplain where they're going to get, fortunately, many people don't lose their lives because of the warning, but they're forced to evacuate and they lose some of their memories and some of their safety and security. So kudos to Pennsylvania.
The next question is phrased as, where would you focus resources to help mitigate the impact of natural disasters? But I'll sort of add the framing to the question is, what are the alternatives that people are thinking about right now that maybe we're not hearing as much about how we might mitigate the impact of natural disasters?
Great. And this is really, well, actually, it's really, there's several ways to do it. First of all, I think education. I think I call myself a public historian because to me, studying history is about engaging the public and trying to get them to think about taking control. And so one of the things, education. So educate people. In some states, you don't even know if the house you're buying has been through a flood. And so you don't have any knowledge. You wouldn't prepare if you're not required to get flood insurance. The other thing is, I love the fact that in some communities, like Harrisburg, they now have signs that FEMA paid for that say this is where the high water mark was. I think that gives people pause to make them think, oh, hold it, you mean that could happen here? I'm driving by, what is it? It's not Stroman bread, but it's a bread factory there, and you're like, oh, there was a flood here? You wouldn't even think of it. So give people that sort of information, and then yes, let's restore the wetlands. I know removing buildings off of the floodplain does mean, though, that public access to one of our great resources, fresh water, scenic recreation, is going to be very useful. So that's the other idea. Here's the problem, and I know it's not easy because houses along riverfronts often pay slightly higher taxes because their valuation is higher, right? They're assessed at a higher value. And so they pay more in taxes. Once you take that building out, you've just lost that tax base for your county. And if you restore it to the community, guess who's going to have to cut the grass and do the other things? It's going to be the community. So you're actually losing, but what are you gaining? You're gaining this invaluable resource, this wonderful waterfront that might have been privatized before, and also then protecting all of us from the risk of flood. So it's a balancing act. And yes, you'll need federal money to help, but FEMA has in the past paid 75% of some of this, and then the county and the state figure out where to get the 25%. So that's one idea.
All right, we got one more question before we finish up. Caroline says, thank you, excellent presentation. I was wondering whether you could speak to flooding of the Lehigh and Delaware rivers at all.
Okay. So, I don't know as much about the Lehigh, but I know that the Delaware River in particular, the natural water course there, they have allowed flooding for many years and have once again dismantled some of the structures there intentionally to create a broader floodplain, right? To allow that natural occurrence. So I think what you're seeing in the 21st century is an acceptance of what we would call a natural hazard, flooding, blizzards, earthquakes, and then an attempt by humans, and I'm borrowing this from a title from a book in 1947, human adjustment. So we're allowing some of these floodings, but I'm less familiar with the Lehigh, so I'll have to look into that.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Kneeland. We really appreciated it. Again, the book has a lot of other really great stories about how other places experienced the hurricane and reacted to it. So I do recommend folks coming by Lancaster History and picking it up. And thank you so much for joining us and for sharing so much about Lancaster County.
Thank you. And thanks again for having me. And thank those of you for attending. Have a great day.
All right. Good night.
Good night.